Hi everyone, Talia from Zart Art, and today we're going to be creating an embossing foil clay print. So to create our embossing foil clay print, first we're going to emboss an image into our foil. So here we have a just standard metallic foil, and we're going to be using a silicone mat underneath so that when we're pressing into the foil with our pencil, it will create an indent. If you do it directly on something hard like a table, then it's a bit harder to get a really nice impression. So going over the top of our silicone mat, here I've just got a simple picture that I created previously. So it's just a very simple landscape that we can place on the foil and trace. This is a good idea to do with students because if your students aren't very confident with drawing and they make a mistake on the foil, there's no getting that impression back out. So to have something that you can trace over means there's less likely to be a mistake. Okay, so just make sure that you place your image over the foil so it's not going to overlap and go off the piece. And this will save a bit of foil in the long run too, instead of doing it directly in the middle. So you don't have to trace with too much force, we just want to get a little bit of an imprint into that foil. Now I've finished tracing and you can see that the image has been very lightly pressed into the foil. So now what I'm going to do is go back over the image and just indent it with a little bit more force with the pencil. If you are using something like an embossing tool or something that has a bit of a sharper edge, just make sure you're a bit more gentle with it because you can poke through the foil if you do use a bit too much force. Okay, so now that we've embossed our image into the foil, you can see both sides. That's quite nice and impressed, so you should be able to feel that texture right through your fingers. Now what I'm going to do is just cut out this piece in a nice circular shape, and then we'll start rolling out our clay. Okay, so now we've got our rough circle. Don't worry if it's not perfect because we will be using this as a template to cut around the clay. So we'll just leave that to the side. And now we'll be using air drying clay. As we don't have a kiln, the air drying clay will work perfectly fine for this, and we'll be using watercolours to colour it in instead of a glaze. So this one is our EC air drying clay. So we'll unwrap. So you won't need too much clay at all because we are rolling it flat, and this clay does dry to a really nice consistency where it won't be easily snapped. So we shouldn't need too much at all to use it for this project. It smells like marzipan. It's delightful. Have you smelt it? Get a whiff. Okay, So now I'm just going to join it into a rough ball so it's easier for us to roll out. just push it down with your palms. And I've got these 2 wooden slats, which we'll put either side. So this will just make sure that our thickness is consistent across the whole piece. And then just rolling it down with a rolling pin. So the EC air drying clay is very similar to a terracotta clay in consistency. It does feel a little bit more firm and slightly more plastic. That's just because it is air drying. It's got more of those components in it that will keep it adhered when it does dry. So because it is a non-kiln fire clay, once it dries, this one becomes very firm and it's hard to snap compared to other air drying clays. So now I'm just going to use a little bit of water to smooth out some of those lumps in the clay. So the air drying clay is a little bit different in consistency when it takes in water. Because it does feel a little bit more plastic, it tends to sit on the surface more so than sink in. So you just have to massage it in a little bit more than you would with natural clay. Okay, so now I'm just making sure it's a nice smooth surface. And then we can just do a little test to see if that's big enough to hold our piece. I might give that a little bit more of a roll out, just to make it a little bit wider. Okay, now that fits pretty well. So when you are pressing your embossing foil into the clay, you can choose which side you want to use. So one side will indent while the other side will push the clay up into those grooves. So I'm going to pick the side that's indented into the clay. So I'm just going to press that in, and you don't have to be too gentle with this at all. Just make sure you press in nice and evenly. If you want to, you can use the rolling pin to roll over as well, but it's a nice sensory experience to be able to feel all of those little grooves in the embossing foil and whether that's pressed into the clay. Okay, so that should be nice and indented. And I'm just going to use a clay tool just to cut around that edge, and you can do whatever shape you want. I'm just going to use a little bit more water to clean up those edges. Okay, so that looks fairly good. Might not be a perfect circle, but if you were very finicky about that, then you could use something to cut out the shape, like a cutter or even a bowl to help you get the perfect circle. But I'm happy with that. I'm just removing the embossing foil very gently. So if you can see that, we've got the indentation of the foil pressed into the clay. And in our next section, what I'll be doing is using watercolour paints to add colour to this, but we do need to wait for the air drying clay to dry. So the air drying clay will take approximately 24 hours for you to be able to paint onto the surface. If you do leave it on a flat surface, what you'll notice is that the bottom of the clay will remain wet, which is fine if you want to use watercolour paint over the top, because we just need that surface layer to be nice and dry for it to absorb the watercolours. Alternatively, you could use a hairdryer as well if you wanted it to dry much quicker. And now we're back with our clay piece. So you can see that that's dried out nicely. So we've left this for a few days to completely dry. And now all I'm going to do is use some watercolour to go over the top and add some colour. So the watercolours that I'll be using are a Mikador brand of dry watercolour. Most brands will work fine, so it doesn't matter too much which ones you're using because they'll sink right into the clay. So with this piece, I'm just using a aqua flow brush, just out of convenience, and you can just control the water a bit easier than having to continuously dip it into a bowl of water. So this will just give a nice light coating of watercolour. Now, as you're changing colour with the brush, you might want to have a spare cup of water just to get any excess colour out, or even a piece of paper to wipe out the brush. So now that I've finished painting the watercolour over, as you can see, the clay dries pretty quickly, so if you want to do extra layers or fix up certain spots, then that's very doable within 5 minutes of painting the first coat. So I'm quite happy with that. There's still some areas to dry before we fully see what it looks like, but otherwise I'll leave that to dry and we'll finish it off there. So this is a really great activity where you can incorporate different skills from drawing to clay work and even some printmaking in there. So if you need an activity that encompasses a range of different mediums and materials, and this is a really fun one to do with a variety of year levels. Really hope you enjoyed the video and we look forward to seeing you next time.